Thank you very much. I've titled my talk for this afternoon, Silent Heroes in an African Story, and it is about learning for the future. And colleagues and friends, all of my life I have been fascinated by the place where we live and the question of how and what we learn. I was born in South Africa in the mid-1960s, and I grew up learning in Africa. I spent my early professional years teaching small children to learn to read and write. At that time, all teachers in South Africa worked in segregated schools, so I, being a white teacher, taught white children to read and write. This was in the early 1980s, when our townships were patrolled by military tanks and when we could be arrested for socializing across the race bar. Our society had been ripped apart by racial segregation, and people were forced to live separated out from each other. It was also, however, a time of great resistance, and the majority of our people, silent heroes in their own time, struggled for an independent, free and non-racial South Africa under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, who at the time was still imprisoned. We know now that these silent heroes won their battle, and in 1994 our country, for the first time in its history, became free. One of the key struggles that were waged in those early days was the struggle to learn. I remember how in the early 1980s I was invited to help a teacher teach reading at a township school up the road from where I was teaching. To do this, I left my comfortable little white school where I was teaching 20 children to work with a teacher who was teaching a class of 80 black children to read in very, very different conditions to those that I had in my classroom. She had only a few reading books, not enough desks, and the school was little more than a tin shack. My school, on the other hand, was a beautifully built and well-resourced facility with more teaching materials than I needed. The inequalities were stark, the transformation pathway enormous. Later on, in the early 1990s, I encountered, amongst others, the work of Rachel Carson, a great woman whose work has changed the way that we think. She and other pioneering environmentalists, also silent heroes in their time, have taught me that we no longer only have the struggle to learn on our hands, but we have a greater struggle. It is the struggle to shape what people learn and how we should be learning for the future. Recently, I visited the Stockholm Resilience Institute, which is one of the world's premier centers for environmental research. Scientists there explain that today we have an extremely complex and uncertain future ahead of us, caused by 4 interrelated problems. You can see there the image that they give us of our planet squeezed, and they talk about the quadruple squeeze. These 4 problems, and I would like to name them very clearly. Firstly, the problem of greed, which manifests in the 80-20 dilemma, and we know what that is. It is that 20% of the world's people are using 80% of the world's resources. The second problem is the problem of degradation, and it manifests in loss of up to 60% of our ecosystems. The third problem, the very complex problem, is the problem of enough, as we seem unable to decide what enough means when it comes to spewing carbon into the atmosphere. And we all know the consequences of that. The fourth problem is the problem of uncertainty, because we don't really know what all of this will do to life on our planet. And our scientists in South Africa are calling this what they call a polycrisis. What we do know, however, is that this polycrisis affects those that are most vulnerable first and most. Let me introduce you to one of the women who, despite inordinate courage and exceptional capabilities, is likely to be the most affected by this polycrisis that our societies have created. Her name, she's over there, is Mrs. Ngobo. She lives in a coastal village just near my university on the southern tip of Africa. Mrs. Ngobo is a grandmother. She receives a pension of 800 Rand a month, which is equivalent to about one of these, US $100 or $3 per day. Recently, Mrs. Ngobo lost both a daughter and a son to HIV and AIDS, and she now looks after, feeds, clothes, and educates no less than 12 children. You can see them there. To cope, Mrs. Ngobo has turned to the sea, and she and her friends, all women in similar circumstances, harvest mussels and other fruits from the sea to survive and to feed their children and their grandchildren. Mrs. Ngobo is not alone. There are millions of mothers and grandmothers in Africa that draw their sustenance from what nature provides them and their families. Up to 75% of people in Africa live in rural areas, and they rely on the natural environment as an important source of livelihood. 75% of Africa's farmers are women. These women are silent heroes in their own right, and they manage to feed and clothe Africa's children despite ever-increasing complexity and hardship. But what will become of them as the ecosystems become more degraded, as climate change changes the circumstances in which they live and farm, and as the phenomenon of greed continues to sharpen the gap between the rich and the poor, and life becomes ever more uncertain? What do they and their children need to learn in such a world? This is the question that I am concerned with today. Friends and colleagues, you, Mrs. Ngobo, and I, we all live here on planet Earth. Like in the early 1980s in South Africa, when we needed silent heroes that were both black and white to transform our country, to set it free, today we need new silent heroes across the planet to help us learn how to transform the world and how to address the polycrisis that we have created. I will now introduce you to some of these new silent heroes and the work that they are doing in Africa. Who are these new silent heroes that you need to know and meet today? In no particular order, here are some of them. There is Rachel, Faleng, and Unesa, and they are teaching children to read the labels of food products so that they can make better choices about what they eat. There is Ntabiseng, who is teaching local government officials how to deliver better waste management services in our town. There is Gwen, Gloria, Gladys, and Nandi, who are teaching children in their schools to plant fresh food without using pesticides or herbicides. Then there is Sibongile and Pat, and what they are doing is they're teaching children how to monitor their water quality and what to do about the high levels of E. coli that are found in the water. There is Ingrid and Didi, who are teaching eco-schools teachers how to make new paper from old paper. There is Maria, who has taught an entire school community how to use eco-loos to solve the school's sanitation problems. There is Ntalevi, and she has taught children to insist on democratic approaches to managing the sanitation problems in their schools. There is Koliswa and Ntosh, who are teaching rural women how to care for the sick. There is Mucha, who has taught my university how to think about its sustainability practices. And there is Nelly, who is teaching children to value and care for wildlife. And there is Sean, who was teaching Mrs. Ngobo and her friends how to harvest their coastal resources more sustainably. Friends and colleagues, I have only introduced you to such a small handful of these women. There are thousands more, and you can find them spread everywhere across the entire continent of Africa. If I had time, I would take you to each and every one of them. I would take you to their classrooms, or the fields and the forests, to the corners of Africa where they teach. And I would show you how each of them is teaching someone else how to learn for the future. These women, and the many men who are equally dedicated to the task of teaching for the future, are the new silent heroes of our time. I've taken some time to analyze what exactly all of these new silent heroes are doing, and I want to share this with you. They are asking critical questions about what is taken for granted. They are introducing people to new knowledge of the world. They are sharing strategies and approaches to investigate what is happening in their surroundings. They are teaching new, practical and creative strategies for living more healthy, sustainable lives. They are developing imagination, and they are teaching new alternatives. And they are also teaching about complexity. They are teaching about resilience. And they are slowly transforming the way that we think and act. These new silent heroes are fundamentally changing the nature and the form of education from a type of education that was focused on transmitting existing knowledge of the world to a type of education that questions the taken for granted, that challenges us to work with and seek out new knowledge and to engage critically and creatively with the practical issues of the time. To create a type of education that engages with transformative alternatives. What is more, they are not restricting their teaching to teaching in schools only, but they are working within school communities, with vulnerable men and women, with factory workers, with decision makers, and with people in all walks of society, even our business leaders, the vice chancellors of our universities, and the mayors of our cities. What is most significant, however, is that they are using teaching approaches that encourage dialogue, love, creativity, empathy, and practical action. Colleagues and friends, they are practicing what the Earth Charter asks us to do. In all these places, these teachers are seeking out ways of responding to risk and uncertainty, and ways to halt degradation and greed. They are trying to teach what enough might mean. But, unfortunately, they remain under-supported. They remain silent heroes, not noticed by anyone much, and their practice is not yet fully understood. I was recently reading Hannah Arendt, and she writes about this idea of the active life, or what she calls the vita activa. And she describes this vita activa as a form of politics which is connected to a category of action that manifests in human freedom. In my view, this is the real work of these teachers. They are engaged in creating the kind of active life that is necessary for human freedom. And Hannah Arendt explains further. She says that we need this kind of politics or involvement in the active life if we are to fend off a totalitarian politics that promotes a belief that nature and people can be controlled by the powerful. We learned in South Africa, through the active politics of the silent heroes of the struggle, that vita activa is possible. So now, we need to strengthen our capacity in Africa and everywhere else for a vita activa that can heal the damage that we have done to our planet and its people. We need to create a new form of freedom for people everywhere. Friends and colleagues, Nelson Mandela, Rachel Carson, and others were able to transform the way that we think about life. They introduced us to learning for the future. Like them, we can all do the same. We can all introduce someone else to learn for the future. And as I have pointed out, there are already thousands of teachers in Africa who are transforming teaching so that Africa's youth and her people can learn the capabilities necessary to confront a degrading and uncertain world. When we look at a picture of the Earth from space, we can see that we are all neighbors and that we share this, our only planet. As men, women, and neighbors that share this place, I ask us to salute, to value, and to support these teachers that are teaching our continent's people and your continent's people how to learn for the future. Your continent, where I'm standing today, is one of the most powerful on Earth. Ours, where I have just come from, is soon to be the most youthful continent on this planet. African women will be the mothers and the teachers of our planet's youth. Together, we will all need to learn how to grow food in ways that do not degrade the soil, and how to make and use energy in ways that do not pollute the atmosphere. We will all need to learn how to save biodiversity, as it provides the foundation of our ecosystems and ultimately our life support systems. We will all need to learn how to produce goods without producing waste. And we will all need to learn how to share the planet's resources more carefully and more equitably. When we look behind those clouds on our planet, we can see that the problems are complex, the inequalities are stark, and the transformation pathway is enormous. In short, we all need to learn to do a multitude of things that are necessary for a more equitable and sustainable future. And to do this, We will need to value and support the thousands of teachers that help us to learn all of these new things. They are the silent heroes of our time. I thank you.